Hello, my name is Andy. My pronouns are he, him, and I want to welcome everyone to All Souls. We welcome you regardless of who you are. We don't just welcome your diversity, we celebrate it. Today is going to be about stories and the messages or morals they contain. We started out with Cats in the Cradle, and by the way, I want to thank the band and especially Heidi Cooper for being here today to help me out. And Cats in the Cradle is a story. Harry Chapin wrote that song, and he was very good about singing ballads. And the message for Cats in the Cradle, I think, is simply be careful of the example you set. Speaking of music, I should warn you I may sing a line later today. I can do many fun things with my voice. Singing is not one of them. Also, I'm going to attempt to answer the philosophical question of why are we here? And speaking of being here, let's all say we're glad you're here to the Zoom audience. And we are all stories in our own way. And we're all part of a larger story. And today we have joined that larger story that is All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church. It's an ongoing story. It's been going on for 131 years now, and I hope it'll go for many years more. Again, welcome, and this is your call to join us today. Thank you.
So when I was around 10 years old, like in 5th grade, had these weird bullying kind of experiences, and I went to talk to my dad about those. Of course, he wanted to make sure that I was okay. He offered some compassion, some words of advice. And then he recommended some books, some stories. One of those books was The Pushcart War by Gene Merrill. Anybody read that? Oh, I'd highly recommend it, especially in the next 100 days. It's a children's book that tells the fictional tale of how these seemingly defenseless pushcart vendors in New York City fought back against these giant trucks and a giant entrenched system that supported them, and they used a brilliant strategy to do this. So that book gave me a sense of hope. Hope that those who run roughshod over others in all kinds of ways can be defeated. Hope that entrenched and unjust systems can be changed. And how relevant is all of that right now? The experience also cultivated an awareness that stories and books can be helpful in changing our own stories. And of course, that humor enhances that message because the book is hilarious. There's some great characters in there. Finally, it also helped me start developing this association between books and love. So that even to this day, a book is the greatest gift imaginable. I just love that. And it took my wife the longest time to understand that. She thought I was just being modest. So way back then, my dad also mentioned something about a bull named Ferdinand. But that's another story. So of course, there are these stories within stories. And as Andy mentioned, we're all connected to the All Souls story. And now you have the opportunity to connect your individual story with that story of this broader community, and doing so in a tangible way, to give voice and action to your intention by simply giving. And we thank you for doing that. The instructions for giving are on the screens behind me and in the chat on Zoom.
So as I often like to do, I want to make this an interactive service. So I'm going to tell you the name of this reflection today, and we all know this question and answer. So let's see how well we do. Why did the chicken cross the road? Oh, come on. We all know to get to the other side. I'm going to try that again. Why did the chicken cross the road? That's much better. Now you might think, well, next slide. Give me the slide for that, please. There we go. Now you might be wondering who that is with the chicken, because even that little chicken joke has a message. And the message is basically the explanation of Occam's razor, and that's William of Occam there, a philosopher from the 12 and 1300s, who basically said the explanation which requires the fewest assumptions is probably the right one. So to get to the other side requires the fewest assumptions, and therefore that's the message of that joke. I'm going to tell another joke, and this one requires a little patience. But this one is also one which requires audience participation. But we all know the formula. So let's see how well we do with this one. Knock, knock. Banana. Knock, knock. Banana. Knock, knock. Orange. Orange, you glad I didn't say banana again? The message in that joke is simply sometimes you need patience. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to tell you a little story from my life, and I'm going to start at my grandmother's funeral, at my mother's funeral. And it was decided by my cousin that we should have pictures of her life all around the viewing. So imagine my surprise when I walk into this viewing, and straight across from the doorway is a picture of what looks like my young grandmother with my daughter, who was 10 or 11 at the time. It clearly wasn't my daughter, but it was my mother, who was a spitting image of my daughter at that same age. Picture was taken in 1950-ish, and it was a very historic day for our family. In the background of that picture, and I wish I had it, was Raystown Lake, which you see here on the screens. And on that particular day, my grandparents and their children went for a Sunday drive, because that's what you did then. And they went up to Raystown Lake, they sat on this hill which overlooked the lake, took the picture, and then on the way back, my grandfather saw a for sale sign in front of a cottage. Didn't even look inside. Went into town, called the number on the sign, and bought the cottage. And for the next 20 years, that was the most wonderful place to go and visit. And in that 20 years, my mother got a little older, got married, had 3 kids, including me. I was the oldest. And the Army Corps of Engineers decided Raystown Lake was not big enough. So they flooded the lake, basically, and compensated everybody. It's okay. Turned out all right. So what happened next was my parents decided, well, we should go find a place that's similar to that. And in that pursuit, they started renting houseboats on different lakes in our area. And one of the places that they decided to go was a place called Dale Hollow Lake, which sits on the Kentucky-Tennessee border. And that right there is going to be important context for this story. As we're on the houseboat, I don't know if you've ever been on a houseboat, but the way they were structured, at least back then, was the front part of the boat, they had the cabin, they had the steering wheel, they had a kitchen and a dining room, and the back part of it was where you slept. You had bunk beds back there. And they were on different levels, so there could be some storage space under that front part. So I was on the top bunk right next to that step that was in between, and it didn't have any railings. So this might explain a lot about me, but I rolled out of the bed and bonked my head on the step. That woke me up, kind of. And it woke everybody in the boat up. My parents got up, and they were very concerned, especially since I started asking awkward questions. Where am I? Who are you? Who am I? So my parents decided we'd better get me to a hospital. Now, again, we're in the middle of a lake in Tennessee, Kentucky area. So my dad packs me onto the little speedboat that we had rented, takes me up to the nearest dock, which was a little mom and pop shop, goes up to the door, and a guy answers the door with a shotgun in his hands. So that's what you do in Tennessee. My dad said, look, you can shoot me, but my boy's been hurt, and I need to get him to a hospital. So that's what the guy did. He put the gun away, and we got into his car. Somewhere along that trip, I came to my senses, came out of the concussion I'd suffered. And of course, the first question out of my mouth was, where am I? My dad was like, it's all right, we're on the way to the hospital. I'm like, what? Why are we going to the hospital? So the moral of that story is, be careful knocking on doors in Tennessee. We eventually settled on a houseboat on Lake Cumberland, Kentucky, and we had some very wonderful times there. Next slide, please. Here we have a lovely picture of myself and my two brothers, and you can see in the background there's a houseboat. That was our houseboat, and we named it the Raystown Encore, because every good memory deserves an encore. Why did the chicken cross the road? Goodness, this is going to be a long service. So recently, I heard there's been studies that have demonstrated that plants have emotions just like we people do. And they decided that they need to assign names to the different plants and their emotions. For example, an angry carrot is a steamed vegetable, which demonstrates that a pun is not really a pun until it's fully grown. All right, now in this picture, you'll see there's a black Labrador who is the runt of the litter. And that's Kelsey, and he became infamous in our neighborhood. So infamous that 25 years after he died, he was brought up at a wedding, my niece's wedding, by friends of the family. Not by us, but by other people who never owned the dog, but obviously were aware of him. The message to that story is, you will be remembered. So the way we got Kelsey was we'd had 3 dogs before him, but for various reasons, they didn't last. We had Cleo, who got hit by a car. We had Cleo the second, who unfortunately got aggressive. And then we had a dog named Keegan, who also got hit by a car. Fortunately, Kelsey was more durable. He hit several cars rather than them hitting him. Left very expensive dents in them, and he walked away all happy. He caught a car. So Dad got Kelsey. He was the runt of the litter. And so he was relatively small for a lab. I don't know how well you can see him in that picture, but if you've ever seen a lab, usually they're kind of large and a little bit bulky. Not Kelsey. He was a string bean. And we had like an 8-day debate over what to call him. And we went through all the usual names, Blackie, Tar, Spot, things that didn't necessarily make any sense. But then my dad found this name in a book of names for babies, Kelsey, which is Celtic for water dweller. Now, we knew that labs were supposed to like the water, but we didn't know how he liked it personally. His first experience with water was frozen. There was a reservoir near where we lived called Geist, which is now an upscale neighborhood. But back then, you could go out there on a cold winter's day and go skating around. Kelsey soon had to figure out, because he was a retriever, we'd throw a stick for him, and he had to figure out how to pick that stick up on the ice. Usually it meant either slowing down really early, which he didn't do a lot, or spinning as he came by it and grabbing it as he went. So he got very good at that. And then we went to our houseboat for the first time. The dog was honestly connected to that boat. We bought him within a few months of buying the houseboat, and he died within a month after we sold it. But on his first trip out there, on our first trip to the houseboat, we got maybe 10 minutes from the dock before he went over the side. He could not wait any longer. He was a water dweller. Identity is worthy of careful consideration. Now, I've mentioned previously in other services that I come from a family of overzealous people. We like to overachieve. We are definitely overachievers, and the dog was no exception. When we would go to the houseboat, we would park the boat, we'd pull it up to a shoreline, and we'd tie it off to some trees, and the dog would inevitably be the first one off the boat and running up and down the shore. Sometimes he'd find not a branch, not a small stick, but an entire tree that had fallen into the water. And he would drag that tree all the way back to the boat. And of course, we'd have to tell him, "You're a good dog, kill it." And he'd gnaw off at a branch, and then we'd have to tell him he was a good dog again. No obstacle is too large to be overcome. I think the funniest thing that ever happened with Kelsey, and there were a lot of funny things, was a particular water skiing day. Now, as you might imagine, a dog might get in the way of water skiing, and so most of the time, we shut him up in the cabin of the houseboat, and he'd bark like crazy, but we'd just ignore him. But on this particular day, my dad decided to let him out because he was an obedient dog, got him up on shore, told him to sit and stay. And he was pretty good about that. And then Dad went directly down the shoreline into the water where my youngest brother, Brian, waited. Now, Brian at the time could water ski, but he was small, so he had to have an adult hold him by the life jacket for a little bit while he got his skis in the right position. My mother and my other brother, Scott, were in the speedboat waiting to go. So Dad gets Brian into position, the skis pop up, and Dad shouts, "Go," which was a release command for the dog. Dog ran down the shore, leapt over my dad, over my brother, and landed in the water in front of my brother. On the speedboat, my other brother is going, "Go, go, go, stop, stop, stop." My mom looks back, there's a kid over there, there's a ski over there, and the dog's just paddling around happy as hell because he just went water skiing. Careful planning is important. Why did the chicken cross the road? You're getting better. All right, next image, please. This is my dad. And I just took this when I went back to Indiana last month. He's 90 years old. A little hard to believe, but he is. And I've got a couple of stories to tell about him. And sadly, they don't necessarily paint him in a good light, but he's a good father. And the first example is, as you might imagine on the houseboat, we occasionally like to have cookouts. And so we'd get out a grill, and Dad would fill it with charcoal, and then he'd light it on fire. He'd usually use a little bit of lighter fluid to get it going. Well, on this particular occasion, he decided the fire was not getting hot fast enough. So he decided to add some lighter fluid. Kids, don't try this at home. The fire decided, hey, that's an opportunity, and started to follow the trail of lighter fluid back to the can. My father decided it was a bad idea to be holding the can, which was probably the only wise thing he did in this circumstance. So he threw it away from himself. As it happened, I was in the bathroom at the time, and I looked out the window and I shouted, "The lake is on fire." My mother shouted back, "Don't flush." Moral of the story is be careful when you add fuel to the fire. The other funny thing that I'm going to tell you about Dad also involves fire, and it involves fireworks. Now, as you might imagine, if you know anything about Kentucky, getting fireworks is pretty easy, especially around the 4th of July. And every 4th of July, we would go and we'd get some fireworks and we'd set them off at the houseboat because it was fun. And every single firework we ever bought had the same instruction: light fuse and get away. Good advice. On this particular occasion, my father was always very organized about this, and so he set all of the fireworks that he was going to set off into a little pile. And he would pick up one at a time, and he'd set it off, and he'd light the fuse and get away. And the second firework he chose to do this with was a thing called a Catherine wheel. And he went straight up the shoreline to a tree. From this pile, he went straight up the shoreline, and he nailed this thing to a tree. A Catherine wheel, basically you light it and it spins around and makes sparkles in a circle. Well, this Catherine wheel wasn't having any of that. It spun around 2 or 3 times and then hopped off the tree, rolled down the shore, straight into the pile of other fireworks. If you've ever seen the movie, the original Pink Panther movie, you know what I'm talking about. Things were going off all over the place. My mother wisely was sitting on the front deck of the boat, nowhere close to it, laughing at us. My brothers and my dad and I were running around trying to avoid the fireworks. Kelsey was trying to catch them. The moral of this story is light fuse and get away. Why did the chicken cross the road? All right, next image. This is my late mother and I, and as you can tell, she was a very serious person, same as I am. The funny story I'm going to tell you about her involves the fact that she was in love with France for a very long time. And as a matter of fact, in 1960, she attended Sorbonne for a year, and she even started to dream in French. By the end of it, she was dreaming in French, and people who didn't speak it were speaking it in her dreams. 40 years later, she decided to make a 40th anniversary return trip. And while she was there, because she was friendly, she struck up a conversation with someone, just kind of at random. My family likes to do that. And in the middle of the conversation, my mother decides to ask, "Where are you from?" And the lady says she's from London. My mother's like, "Why the hell are we speaking in French?" Neither one had realized the other was not a native French speaker. That's how good Mom was. So you never really know who you're talking to. Why did the chicken cross the road? You guys are getting good about this. All right. Now, I like to tell stories clearly. And there's a famous storyteller by the name of Louis L'Amour. Who has heard of Louis L'Amour? Oh, cool. Well, I've heard an anecdote about Louis. Now, the thing about him is that he wrote a lot of stories. He wrote a lot of books. And he liked to get up early in the morning, have his breakfast really quick, and then go at it on his typewriter. And the story goes that one morning his wife asked him, "Why do you do this? Why do you get up so early every morning and start typing away on whatever story you're working on?" And he always said, "Because I want to know what happens next." Surprises are everywhere. And I can say that I can vouch for this experience because I'm a storyteller too. And I like to write stories. And I once wrote a story or was working on one. And there was a character in it who was a cat. And he was an intelligent cat. He could speak. He was kind of a magical cat. And I had this whole scene planned out where the characters were in a big trouble and they were trying to deal with things. And when I imagined it in my head, it went one way. But when I actually wrote it out, the cat died. I got really emotional about that. I can't tell you. And every time I would go back and edit it, I got emotional again. So you can surprise even yourself. Speaking of surprises, next image. Nope, that's Louis L'Amour. I skipped one. So here we have a picture of Napoleon Bonaparte. He's pretty recognizable. And a rabbit. Now, some of you may have been told his worst battle ever was Waterloo. No, it was the Battle of the Rabbits. The story goes is that at one point he had a big victory and he wanted to celebrate, and so he asked his number one guy, "I want to celebrate with a rabbit hunt. Let's get a bunch of our noble folk together and we'll just have a rabbit hunt." Well, his advisor decided the easiest thing to do was to go to a rabbit farm where they raised rabbits to be pets. So he bought a lot of these pet rabbits. When the moment came, they released them, and instead of running away, they ran towards the hunters. The hunters didn't know what to do. Napoleon didn't know what to do, and they all got overran by hundreds of rabbits. Napoleon eventually had to be packed up and taken away. Never underestimate your opponent. Why did the chicken cross the road? All right. Now I want to tell you about context. As any good storyteller would tell you, context is important. So I'm going to describe a story that you're all familiar with, but you won't recognize it. This story involves a young woman who travels to a foreign land and kills the first person she encounters. Not satisfied with that, she hooks up with three strange men and sets out to kill again. I'm talking about the Wizard of Oz. And the moral of that story, of course, is there is no place like home. Now, let's go to the next image. Speaking of context, we all know Charlie Chaplin, right? He's easy to recognize, but did you know he once came in third place in a Charlie Chaplin look-alike contest? It's true. Because, of course, when we think of Charlie Chaplin, this is what he looks like. But he was just wandering down the road, came across this contest and decided to enter it. But he wasn't looking like this. He was looking like his normal day-to-day self. So he did not look like himself. The moral of this story is image is everything. Why did the chicken cross the road? All right, I'm going to ask for this. I've got one final story and a half to tell, and I'd like the band to go ahead and come up on stage again. My earliest memory is of darkness, followed by light, followed by the thought, my name is Andy. And when I described this memory to my mother, we both came to the unlikely conclusion that I remembered being born. And I realized how wild and far-fetched that sounds, but darkness and then light and then identity. And that identity part makes me think that reincarnation is a noisy thing. Reincarnation is a real thing. And this is where a story within a story comes in. I don't know if you've ever heard of or read the story called The Egg, but I'd like to believe that it's true. The idea of the egg is that every time we die, we're reincarnated as someone else. And that eventually we get reincarnated as everybody else. So whenever we're talking to somebody, it's some other incarnation of who we are. And I think that is just an absolute beautiful, beautiful story. And so I think that this kind of highlights where I tried to go with this whole stories thing. I want to demonstrate why we are here. Now, some of you may have read the description of today's service and said, hey, Andy's doing the service, it's going to be funny. And I've gotten a few chuckles today, and I appreciate that, because I feel that the reason we're really here, the reason we're all put here on this earth, is to bring joy to the world, to all the boys and girls. Joy to the fishers in the deep blue sea. Joy to you and me. And by the way, Jeremiah was a bullfrog.
Joy to you and me.
Woohoo! Every story has a message. The chalice is extinguished, but its story lives on in its message of love, as its message of love remains in our hearts as we enjoy fellowship and leave this place. Go and bring joy to this world.